Today, I want to talk to you about how minions work in conjunction with their individual skills that they are attached to. So, things like amplify damage, things like field by death, things like, how Skeletal Warrior Mastery actually impacts their damage, how much it goes up by, and I have some footage that will be playing in the background while we go through and talk about every single individual thing that I tested personally. There's quite a few things. We have their base damage for Skeletal Warriors. We have base damage plus Fueled by Death passive when it's procced. We have Amplify damage, Raise Skeleton, Decompose, Blight, and the Skeletal Warrior Mastery. Now, I do have the same character, and they are much higher level now. We have tested the same thing on the mages and the golem, and found that all the data holds up. A lot of the bonuses do conjoin together to make certain ones better than others. We'll talk to them when we get to them. But before we get into all of those videos, I do want to let everyone know that I do stream over on Twitch, twitch.tv/jacket. The same thing here. It's always the name. And it would be great if you guys can go over there and follow me. We do a lot of the testing over there as well, as I've been filming a lot of hardcore content for our Summoner Necromancer up until Season 1. We'll probably move over to Season 1 content after that. And I also plan on doing most of my testing there. I think we're going to start Season 1 with the Druid, so if that interests you, catch me live there, and let's get into the video. So, I want to talk about how we came across a lot of the determinations that we did when making this I guess you could say science experiment. So we establish a baseline by having absolutely no buffs. We don't have Skeletal Warrior Mastery. We don't have Raised Skeleton buff up. We don't have Fueled by Death, Amplified Damage, no Paragon points, nothing. We're level 15. It is strictly what our current character's equipment has on it, and then the damage coming from those skeletons. So we wanted to establish a baseline there. And from the baseline, we're able to make a lot of determinations. We get our damage range. Sometimes it's between 7 and 12. Sometimes it's between much higher numbers, especially when we move into like the Reapers. The Reapers have a determination between like a big swing compared to their regular hits. And so that's why I wanted to compile all of this footage that we have so that we can showcase exactly what the original damage comes from, establish that baseline, and then we can use that to move forward to see exactly how certain buffs are interacting with our character. Now, there's going to be no surprise when it comes to it. We have footage for all three classes of the warriors. We have the skirmishers, the defenders, and the reapers. We have the ability now to find out exactly what approximate percentage that Reaper big swing is at. So that's really cool. We'll talk about that when we get to the Reapers. Probably add that towards the end of the video. We could talk about how we found out that most of the sheet damage is actually 30%. It's exactly what that tooltip says on that loading screen. I know, big shock to everyone else, but it's really good to get confirmation because you'll be adding tons and tons of damage and thinking, wow, these numbers are so big, and then you'll find out in the ARPG that those numbers aren't so big. So we wanted to test those out, see exactly how it worked out, and that's exactly what this video is for. And so we came to the conclusion that the sheet damage itself is that 30% because of the Fuel by Death passive, which is the first thing we'll be talking about in this video. The Fuel by Death passive seemed to almost do nothing for the warrior damage. I'm talking we might see a higher number occasionally, but between might seeing a number occasionally and what we saw with amplified damage, which is also 9%, was an entire night and day difference. We're talking I could visibly see the average number going up for amplified damage, and Fuel by Death was like, it's not even factoring it in. But that's what's really cool about some of this. So Fuel by Death increases for characters all damage by 9%. So it has a formula that gets factored in. If you have 100% all damage, you get the 9% that's factored into that formula. It turns out it's like 118% it adds up to be. But what it seems like is that you take your current number that you have of all the additive damage. If you have a multiplicative number in there, then the multiplicative number is going to get multiplied by that, so you'll be 109%, and then for some reason it adds on an extra 9%. I'm not sure exactly where that's coming from, but essentially you get 118% damage. And I can confirm this with my main character. I might splice in some footage, I don't know if I will or not. But my main character did do this. I did test this a lot with it, where I have almost exactly 100% all damage. It's like give or take a few, like point percentage, like 0.35 I think is what it's at currently. And so that's what's really cool about this, is that it has all of that factored in, and the more damage you have of the all damage, the more Fueled by Death is going to do for your warriors and minions. So that's really cool about that. So what this means is that Fueled by Death is going to be less on our priority when we're picking talents for minions. If we're not stacking a lot of all damage, which sometimes we will, sometimes we won't, then we may or may not take this, and Thorns may end up being shining on top if we can find a way to fit in the glyph that makes minions do more Thorn damage. As we progress, we'll start to talk about more about the theoretical stuff about how a small multiplier of 10x ends up being a lot more than something like a 9x that gets translated into sheet damage that ends up being less damage. So based on what we have, we will make some more decisions on it. But moving on to amplify damage. So amplify damage was quite an eye-opener for me when we were testing out some of these things. What amplify damage ended up showing us was when something is being debuffed, it means that the minions get full value. There's no 30% of the value of which they would apply, and there's a couple instances which this is an insane amount of damage that it can be given to us. When we have the aspect of Grasping Veins on, what that does is makes it so when we cast Corpse Tendrils, we get a buff, and that buffs our crit chance, which then gets diminished by 30% for the minions. But what it also does is applies a debuff to the target, making that target take 120% increase of damage from critical strike damage, which means that the minions will get the full value of that 120%, which is a multiplier on top of their damage. So when they are critting, which they will crit when you use Corpse Tendrils, is going to be insane. It's going to be something that will now elevate our damage to a higher value. We have a few things that can stack on top of this, so things like Aspect of Reanimation may be really good as well. But what I have found to be something in conjunction with these findings is that when you mathematically scope out if having one extra skeletal mage it does more damage than having 15% increase more damage baseline, it ends up working out mathematically that you're better off putting your viscous aspect on your necklace, giving you the extra mage, because having that 6th mage ends up doing more damage overall than it does having an extra percentage on your minions. Now, if you're not wanting to deal with so many being alive, that's understandable. You can always swap those two around. But this is why testing this stuff is so important. Amplified damage has now opened our eyes on how certain things can be applied to the minions. And this goes on to the mages, this goes on to the golems. And now that we understand that debuffing a target gives us the entire value, we can now use that moving forward. And I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but what I want to just reiterate if I did, or just mention, is that we know that amplified damage is giving us the full amount because it is a noticeable difference in each of the classes of warriors compared to Fueled by Death. They're the same values. Fueled by Death is a buff that we get, but amplified damage is not a buff that we get. It's actually a debuff that the monster gets. And so this is where that distinction matters, which is really awesome. So we get to make this determination about if we want to take a certain amount of damage from what we're being debuffed, how we're buffing our skeletons, how all that intertwines together. And again, amplified damage has no other scalar to it, so you're just buffing your minions damage by that 9%, which is a multiplicative 9%, which adds on to, as we talked about earlier. So it's something that is definitely to be looking out for. Now, the next thing that I do want to talk about is going into Raised Skeleton. How does Raised Skeleton impact these minions? And to no surprise to anyone, Ray Skeleton does exactly what it says out to do. It's going to heal your minions 10% of their life over the 5-second duration, which is indicated above the Ray Skeleton icon. And then it's also going to give you that 20% damage increase. Now, this 20% does seem to be multiplicative. It does seem to be something that you want to have active as much as possible, which is a great thing. And it's very easy to do. When you're taking Reapers that generate corpses, it means that Ray Skeleton is almost up 100% of the time, and then in conjunction with one of the skill points that heals your minion's HP over heals 60% once that duration has ended as well, which is fantastic. So it's every 5 seconds. So there's not a lot to say about Ray's Skeleton. It's doing exactly what it needs to do. You want to make sure that if you are in part of a minion build, you are using Ray's Skeleton as you need to do it. And that pretty much sums up Ray's Skeleton. There'll be some footage playing above showing what I needed to do. So I had myself outside of the arena generating corpses to be able to spam it to test this out. But you can see that the numbers are clearly higher than what the base values are at. And it's pretty much doing exactly what it needs to be doing. And just to give you a little more insight into what we are looking for when we are trying to compare it to the individual numbers is, we're monitoring the buff that is above the Ray Skeleton bar. We're monitoring the buffs that we have on our bar for like Fueled by Death. And that is allowing us to compare when we're looking at the numbers. You can do so as well as you're watching this video. We see and wrote down the base values. We got about a damage range that we were comfortable with, excluding a little bit of the outliers, and then moving forward and going in and seeing what the new numbers were once we were testing out some of these damages, and they do roughly translate to that multiplicative damage. So that is very nice and was easy for us to kind of scope out as we were talking and going through some of these numbers. Now, one of the key factors here that I have noticed that I'm not going to mention too much, but I wanted to kind of call it out, is that the 30% skirmisher buff seems to be kind of a bait. They use a one-handed weapon, and it seems like the same one-handed weapon logic versus two-handed weapon logic is kind of coded into the way the warriors work, which is very interesting. It doesn't work for anything else but just the warriors, so you want to make sure you're always using the Reapers, as they're going to be doing the most damage per swing as well. I think the warriors, skirmishers, attack a little bit faster, but it's not very noticeable. The Reapers attack in an area of effect, and they also have a big swing. So it's really not worth using that 30%. Don't get baited by seeing the 30% increased damage, and make sure that you just stick with the Reapers, as they also generate corpses, and it just makes the entire minion experience much better. So, moving on to Decompose. So I don't have too much else to say about how minions work. There'll be a couple wrap-up thoughts after we talk about Decompose and Blight. But what I do want to mention is that both Decompose and Blight are only active when you are currently having those enemies affected by those status ailments, and then for a short time afterwards. It seems like there's built in a bit of latencies just to have that combat flow feel a bit better. So we'll have a very brief amount of footage of both Fueled by Death and Decompose showing the numbers. We were able to see the similar numbers to Amplify Damage, which further boosted our conclusion of Amplify Damage. So it was really interesting how all of these things kind of came together to give us these exact findings. We have things like Decompose being 10% instead of 9%, but giving the same exact results as Amplify Damage. So that's what was super nice about finding that. We had both the antithesis of Fueled by Death not giving us the increase. We had Decompose giving us the confirmation that Amplify Damage was in fact boosting it, because we had no doubts that Blight and Amplify Damage were Blight and Decompose were working. So because those were showing the numbers that we were expecting, was fantastic. We knew that we were getting the exact values that we needed to confirm, and that's how we were able to decide exactly how Amplify Damage, and now, moving and segueing over to the aspect of Grasping Veins, how that can apply to our minions, which is very good for deciding which aspects to take, how to min-max a build, and just really deliver on amplifying that damage, pun intended, about all of our minions. And so Decompose does great work here. It makes you stand still. It's good with Intercom, because Intercom works just like Intercom works just like name of the thing, Fueled by Death. Intercom works just like Fueled by Death, and so having those stack up gives them both more damage. So that's really interesting to work with when you have Decompose plus Intercom. You're standing still, giving 10% more damage. The all damage gets amplified by both 30% and 9%. That's really good. And then Blight is fantastic. There's a couple aspects that work with Blight with grouping everything together. Aspect of the Void, it's a phenomenal one. It has no cooldown and also has no diminishing return, so you can constantly be shuffling around the battlefield as you need them to. Say you have a suppressor, you can kind of keep pulling them towards your mages as you need be if you're using mages as a source of damage, which is what I would recommend. And so that kind of wraps up everything we have regarding our knowledge on the minions, what we wanted to find out during our testing here. And so that's really what we needed to see, right? We needed to see exactly how the X multipliers are working, how the plus modifiers were working. There was some damage testing done off screen here that we haven't shown the footage for, but it's on my Twitch channel again. That's twitch.tv/jacket. And that has some testing for the mages and the golems. And so it really came down to, okay, we can confirm that all of these are working in this exact way, but how does that translate to the Paragon board? And so you can see that when you have the Skeletal Warrior Mastery and Skeletal Warrior glyph inside of your rune set, it kind of bumps up everything that you're doing. So the Skeletal Warrior Mastery is now playing into a multiplicative amount of what your additive damage was to your Skeletal Warriors. It's really confusing. It's really weird. Just, go into a town, put in the Skeletal Warrior glyph, take a look at the number, observe it, walk out of town, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about, where the multiplicative bonuses start working, and you can see how it goes. Instead of just getting 60% extra damage, you end up getting like 200% increased damage, like I did with my mages. So it's very interesting how it all works together. What ends up happening is that every single time you want to buff your minion damage, you want to make sure you're getting an X multiplier. There's a couple glyphs that do this very well, like Corporeal for when you're using Bone Mages, Amplify for when you're using any curse within your build, which I would recommend using Decrepify for the cooldown reduction. And truly, you can just sacrifice any amount of plus damage for any time you're getting that, even something as small as 10% X damage. When you're getting the 10% multiplicative damage, it's so much better than like 100% additive damage. Right now I'm using the Mage Glyph in my level 100 build, and currently trying to play around with seeing if a 10x multiplier is better. Sorry, let me rephrase that. A 10% X multiplier is better than 200% additive skeletal mage damage. I know, crazy, right? But that ends up being how that math works out, where if you just get a small multiplier, you're doing so much more damage because it's multiplying on multiplying on multiplying on multiplying, and it just ends up escalating out of control. So, I do appreciate you watching. If you do want to stay until the end, I do have Skeletal Warrior Mastery playing out towards the end. You can take a look at that damage. That damage is a insane amount. It's 45% increased damage. It's what I would recommend taking if you plan on doing anything with Skeletal Warriors. It's a no-brainer for the health regardless, anyways, when you're doing a minion build. I do appreciate you watching, so make sure you drop a like on the video, comment your thoughts on what we talked about. Check me out over at twitch.tv/jagged. I know I mentioned a few times, sorry for the shameless plugs. But really, this is what I've been focusing on, and we'll have a couple build videos coming out. Stay tuned for those, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.